Hi guys, I'd like to start reading to you a book that I really enjoy. I think you're going to like it a lot. Name of this book is called Soldier's Heart, and the author is Gary Paulsen. He's a Minnesota guy. I really enjoy this book because it does a great job of creating some pretty good pictures, mental pictures of what life was like as a Civil War soldier. And this particular soldier, his name is Charlie Goddard, really did exist. It's from Minnesota. I want to caution you ahead of time, though, this book can be somewhat graphic at times. By graphic, I mean it's very descriptive. There's some scenes in here with a lot of blood and guts, and I'll try and warn you when it's coming up. But otherwise, I think you're going to enjoy this quite a bit. So, if you have any questions, please shoot me some questions you might have on Schoology. I will go ahead and stop this from time to time, interrupt the readings to make a point, clarification. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started with this. I think you're going to like it. All right. I'll read you the foreword first. War is always, in all ways, appalling. Lives are stopped in youth, worlds are ended. And even for those who survive, and the vast majority of soldiers who go to war do survive, the mental damage done is often permanent. What they have seen and been forced to do is frequently so horrific and devastating that it simply cannot be tolerated by the human psyche. Now there's an attempt to understand this form of injury and deal with it. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, by those who try to cure it. They give it a technical name in the attempt to make something almost incomprehensible understandable, in the hope that by doing this, they will make it curable. But in other times, in other wars, they use more descriptive terms. In the Second World War, the mental damage was called battle fatigue, and there were rudimentary efforts to help the victims. These usually involved bed rest and the use of sedatives or other drugs. In the First World War, it was called shell shock, based on the damage done by the overwhelming use, for the first time in modern war, of artillery fire against soldiers in stationary positions. Or trenches. And when you guys study World War I next year, you'll hear of trench warfare. That's pretty much what they're talking about here. The concussion of exploding incoming rounds, thousands upon thousands of them, often left men deaf and dazed, many of them with a symptom called the 1,000-yard stare. The afflicted were essentially not helped at all, and simply sent home for their families to care for. Most were irrational. Many were in a vegetative state. In the Civil War, the syndrome was generally not recognized at all. While the same horrors existed as those in modern war, in some ways they were even worse, because the technological aspect of war being born then, the wholesale killing by men using raw firepower, was so new and misunderstood. The same men were fed into the madness. But in those days there was no scientific knowledge of mental disorders, and no effort was made to help the men who were damaged. Some men came through combat unscathed. Most did not. These men were somehow different from other men. They were said to have a soldier's heart. That was a foreword, so now I'd like to bring you Chapter 1. June 1861. He had heard it all, Charlie did. Heard the drums and the songs and the slogans, and knew what everybody and his rooster was crowing. There was going to be a shooting war. They were having town meetings and nailing up posters all over Minnesota, and the excitement was so high that Charlie had seen girls faint at the meetings, just faint from the noise and the hullabaloo. It was better than a circus, or what he thought a circus must be like. He'd never seen one. Never seen anything but Winona, Minnesota. And the river, 5 miles each way from town. Let's see if I can pull up a map for you here in a little bit. But Winona, Minnesota is on the southeastern side of the state, right on the Mississippi River. So here's a guy, Charlie Goddard, living in small town Minnesota in the 1860s, and unfortunately, he's looking for a little bit of excitement because he thinks his life is pretty boring. There would be a shooting war, and there were rebels who had violated the law and fired on Fort Sumter, and the only thing they'd respect was steel, it was said. And he knew they were right, and the Union was right. And one other thing they said as well, if a man didn't hurry, he'd miss it. The only shooting war to come in a man's life, and if a man didn't step right along, he'd miss the whole thing. Charlie didn't figure to miss it. The only problem was that Charlie wasn't rightly a man yet, at least not to the Army. He was 15, and while he worked as a man worked in the fields all of a day and into night, and looked like a man, standing tall and just a bit thin, with hands so big they covered a stove lid. He didn't make a beard yet, and his voice had only just dropped enough so that he could talk with men. The guy's only 15 years of age. How old do you have to be to enlist in the Army? You think 15's young? I don't know. If they knew he was but 15, they wouldn't take him at all. But Charlie watched, and Charlie listened, and Charlie learned. Minnesota was forming a volunteer regiment to go off and fight. It would have near on 1,000 men when it was full. Men from Winona and Taylor's Falls and Mankato, and as far north as Deerwood, and from the capital, St. Paul, as well. 1,000 men, and Charlie had learned one thing about an army. One part of an army didn't always know the business of another part. 1,000 men in the regiment would be in companies of 80 to 100 men from each section, and it would be hard for a man to know men who weren't from the same area. Charlie couldn't join where they knew him. Somebody would spill the beans, and he'd get sent back or used as a runner or a drummer boy. He wasn't any boy. He was going to sign to fight as a man, and he knew a way to do it. They would gather at Fort Snelling, up along the Mississippi. All the companies from all the towns would assemble there before they went off to fight. He'd just take him a walk, Charlie would. Take a walk by himself until he was at Fort Snelling, and there he would lie about his age and sign up as a man and get him a musket and a uniform and go to see what a war was like. "I won't get in any trouble, Ma," he said, wrapping some bread and cold potatoes and half a roast chicken and some toe cotton. "Plus they'll be paying me. I hear they give $11 a month. I'll send most of it on home to you and Orrin." Orrin was his younger brother. "You can use the money and I won't be under your feet all the time." "Well, you aren't under my feet." She hated it when he talked fast. He always got his way when he talked fast. He'd smile and that cowlick would stand up in the back, and he'd talk fast, and she couldn't keep him from what he wanted. He was a good boy, as good as they came. But ever since his father, Paul, had been kicked to death by a horse gone mad when a swarm of bees landed on it, Charlie only had to smile and talk fast, and he got his way. "You haven't ever been under my feet." "Same as," he said, shaking his head. "I'm always in the way. Best I go off and see what the big fuss is all about. You ain't but a boy, and I've got to be a man sometime. You've said it more than once yourself, Charlie. You've said you've got to be a man. Well, here it is, my chance to be a man. A boy wouldn't go off to earn $11 a month and wear a uniform, only a man. So I'm going to be a man and do what a man can do." And he won. She knew he would, and he did. And he took his bread and cold potatoes and chicken, and he left home walking down the road for Fort Snelling. And if she had known what was to come of it, if she had known and could tell him what would come of it, she would have fought to drag him back and let the federal government keep their $11 a month. But she had heard the songs and the slogans and seen the parades, had been to the meetings, and though it was her son Charlie leaving, she did not think it would be so bad. Nobody thought it would be so bad. Nobody thought it could be so bad. and all the officers and politicians and newspapers said it would be a month or two. No longer. It would all be over by the fall. End of chapter 1.